Welcome to the Kinvestor Report, where we sit down with analysts and industry experts to discuss mining, commodities, and the market. I'm your host, Arlen Hansen. This interview is not investment advice. It is for listening pleasure only, and I will disclose any positions owned by Kin or myself in this interview. Full disclaimer at the link below. Today, I'm joined once again by Chris Berry, president of House Mountain Partners. He's been an independent analyst for 13 years with a focus on battery metal supply chains, and that's why we like to keep bringing him on. He's one of our fan favorites, as we've talked about lithium and graphite in the past. And today we're talking about a little known metal called antimony. Chris, great to have you on the show again. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah. Well, you are our go-to guy when we start talking about metals and minerals that we don't know a lot about. Okay. And something's come up in the market here in the last month or so called antimony. And some of these stocks went crazy. Can you first tell the market what antimony is and like what its primary uses are?
Yeah, look, antimony is one of this sort of growing list, I think, of critical or strategic metals as classified not just by the United States government, but by a number of governments around the world. And it does have some uses in military applications, but I think the kind of everyday use that people would be most familiar with is as a fire retardant.
Mm-hmm. And so why is this becoming such a big deal? Like Perpetua Resources just went berserk when
Absolutely.
when China started talking about limiting their imports or their exports,
Well,
sorry.
sure. It's all about the export control game. There is clearly a tit for tat going on, right, between the United States and China with respect to, you can sort of see, it's almost like tennis or ping pong. It just goes back and forth. The United States ratchets up semiconductor export controls or things like that, or forbids sales, whatever you want to call it. And then, of course, the Chinese probably have anticipated this. And again, they know that they are responsible for imports into the United States of probably 2/3 or maybe 3/4 of what we would call critical or strategic metals that are vital to the defense industrial base here in the United States and North America for that matter. And so, we tighten the noose, if you will, around semiconductor exports, and then they take a look at that list and say, and of course, this isn't the first time that this has happened, right? I think the last time we spoke about gallium and germanium, and since then, now there are export controls around graphite. And of course, antimony is only the latest example. These moves, if you will, by the Chinese government, again, not new. I've only listed sort of 3 relatively recent instances. But when you think about how dominant, just as a brief aside, how dominant the Chinese are in rare earth elements. I mean, they have had a quota system for exports of rare earth elements for years. And so, again, we should not be surprised that this sort of economic warfare is something that the Chinese are resorting to.
Mm-hmm. So a question, but when you talk about like flame retardant or fire retardants, like this doesn't sound so critical to me.
Well, if your house is on fire, I think it's
Right,
pretty
but
good.
but are there not other uses? Like graphite has, a lot of fire retardant uses as well, right? So is it that much of a just an important metal for this that there's no replacements for it?
There are substitutes for everything, right? I mean, even, when you think about some of the battery metals, everyone's really focused, for example, on nickel or cobalt or magnesium, not magnesium, excuse me, manganese. I mean, even on the rare earth side, on the magnets, right? I mean, you can build permanent magnets without rare earth elements. The issue is you're going to sacrifice weight and you're going to sacrifice performance. And so typically, whether or not it's antimony with some of its uses or rare earth elements, or even in the batteries, usually when you try and minimize antimony's use or minimize, dysprosium or anything like that in the magnets, you're going to use more of something else. And so you might
Right.
have some cost savings, and you might not be as dependent on that given metal or mineral, but there are probably some economic sacrifices that you're going to make. And again, economics drives everything. So that's really the issue.
Mm-hmm. And it looks like antimony is, well, the name derives from the Greek word antimonos, meaning not alone. So it looks like it's really only a byproduct metal. There's no primary production of antimony anywhere. Is that correct?
Not that I'm aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the things that makes, a company like you mentioned, Perpetual Resources, sort of go bananas, right? When
Yeah.
when the Chinese do what they do. I mean, obviously the United States government is aware of this issue, and they're aware of Perpetua because I believe Perpetua has received DPA Title III money from the Department of Defense. DPA is the Defense Production Act. That's a Korean War era law that effectively allows the U.S. government to fund the development of domestic natural resources that are critical to national security.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if they would have got their permits if they didn't have the antimony in their back pocket. Just
Probably not, you know,
uh,
but this is we always sort of wait until it's almost too late before. What was it? Winston Churchill said the Americans always do the right thing, but they exhaust every other option up until that point. So maybe this is the situation there.
mhm. Do you know of any major producers like on the big board? Like we talk about Perpetua, I guess that's a TSX listed company, but are there any American listed companies out there that got exposure to antimony?
Not that I'm aware of, American listed. I mean, you know, I know there's some production of antimony, and I think in Mexico, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, not too familiar with any of the the producers there. I have a feeling that again, we were chatting earlier before we started. I mean, the Chinese were sort of thinking about all of these issues around resource dependency 15 or 20 years ago, and so I would be willing to bet that if there are antimony deposits or production out there, let's say ex the United States, there is probably some form of Chinese investment or involvement today.
Mm-hmm. It feels like antimony is just like a small piece of a giant chess game that's being played here.
Sure, absolutely.
And it feels like, the BRICS and Russia, like they're thinking many, many, many plays in advance. And it feels like the American supply chain is just so far behind this game right now. Like, can you just comment on this game of chess that like I call it the game of resource wars right now, right?
Sure.
It to me, this is resource wars. This is securing critical metals and supply for your country. And
Yeah.
when it comes down to it, they're only going to care about themselves.
The irony is, Arlen, that most of these critical metals or minerals are not rare. We always used to joke that rare earth elements were not appropriately or not properly named because they're literally everywhere. I mean, even lithium, right? Like the indispensable battery metal, as it's called.
Yeah.
I mean, you could extract it from seawater if the price ever got high enough and your technology ever made the most, or I guess help with the economics. But what the United States, what Canada, what the European Union, what a lot of countries or trading blocks in the West are now doing, which is trying to accelerate the build out of these critical material supply chains. To your point, the Chinese were doing 15 years ago. And so, look, I mean, the good news is the following. We have the Inflation Reduction Act. We have all sorts of legislation. Perhaps we can get into some of those details. But, so we have the legislation, we have the deep liquid capital markets, we have the intellectual property. The question is, do we have the political will to see this through? I mean, obviously here in the United States, we sort of think about things from one election cycle to the next. And again, in China, it's a much different, longer term game. And so the only thing that I don't want to say keeps me up at night, but the one thing that I sort of think about is I try and say, okay, how do we not necessarily outcompete the Chinese, but how do we catch up, or how do we just sort of build a regionalized supply chain for these critical materials? It really is political will.
So you said like a lot of these rare earths aren't rare, and I totally agree, right? Lithium's found everywhere. Uranium literally found anywhere. Graphite, there's more graphite on this planet to, power 1 billion batteries for the rest of our lives, right? So do they call them rare just because they're not available in the States? They're not being produced in the States, or like it's just something that's we coined these metals years ago and it's just
Yeah.
stock. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's mostly it. I mean, rare earth elements, I think were coined as such simply because it was rare to find them in economic quantities, right? And so
Hmm.
again, the challenge, of course, with rare earth elements is they're all found in deposits, again, all over the world, some in clays, some in hard rock, different host rocks. But the separation and the purification of rare earth elements is what makes it rare, what makes them rare. And again, this is something that the Chinese 10, 15, 20 plus years ago crack the code on. And
Mm.
so, even when Mountain Pass, sorry to interrupt you, but even when, MP Materials came back to life during the SPAC boom, they were mining material and still sending it over to China to be separated and purified. The good news is, again, thanks to what I had mentioned earlier, largesse from the United States government in the form of loans and grants, we are now starting to build that specific supply chain here in the US. But again, I wish I could tell you that, by next year we will be self-sufficient in X or Y, but we just won't. And, I'm not sure we necessarily will ever be, to be honest with you. It's a much broader conversation around, are we really going to deglobalize or have our own kind of closed economic system, or will China always play a part? So it's a bigger issue, and I don't think the last chapter has sort of been written on that one yet.
In the government, is it managed by like a group of people or legislation that says, okay, we're going to tackle this whole rare earth industry? Or are they looking at it siloed, like, oh, how are we going to tackle the graphite? How are we going to run after the antimony? Are they looking at all these and trying to plug holes separately? Or are they trying to solve the entire problem at once?
That's one of the challenges. You had what I would argue is a very siloed view. You had the Department of the Interior thinking about permits and land use. You had the Department of Defense worried about where are we going to get the rare earths for our missiles. The Department of Commerce had a view. The State Department has a view. And so you didn't really historically have a lot of cross-departmental coordination on these issues, but you do now for sure. It's just, again, the U.S. government is sort of like the Titanic, and it just doesn't turn on a dime. So again, that's the good news, right? The political will, there's this realization that, wow, the Chinese are X number of years ahead in critical material supply chains, for lack of a better phrase. I mean, I think it's fair to say that they are dominant in batteries, dominant in electric vehicles, and you could make an argument that even in sort of semiconductors or quantum computing, they may not be dominant, but they're certainly pushing in that direction. And so that's sort of, I think, woken the U.S. government up out of its slumber, which is a good thing.
Yeah, well, I think what the government's doing is they're being reactive. They're not being proactive. Right. And then you're always being behind when you're acting that way. Right. You're always trying to play catch up. Like, oh, how do I figure this out? And you're just always behind that way. Right. And going back to your comment about the Chinese figuring this out 15, 20 years ago. So they didn't figure out how to find deposits. They figured out how to process.
Yeah.
And that IP, the technology. So the question is, when it comes to like the tax regime of the government and these new policies they're putting in place for tax breaks for the infrastructure and the supply chain, can we get that IP from China, bring it over here, and still be considered like U.S. born and bred and raised?
Good question. It's a nuanced answer. I think that, the Inflation Reduction Act does a lot in terms of helping to build different pieces of a battery supply chain. It does not do much, to be honest, for actual mining. If there was some sort of permit reform that could have been lodged in there, that would be great. But no such luck. But, to your point, I think I would agree that I think the critical vulnerability in the supply chain today is that refining step. And again, you can sort of go down the list, whether or not it's lithium or nickel or cobalt or what have you. Most of the refining capacity for almost all of these critical metals exists today in China. Again, the good news is, if you want to take it this way, the good news is that while China has the majority of the actual refining capacity, they do not, at least in my view, have a lock on the IP around separation and purification. Okay, so that's the good news. And so again, I mentioned earlier, we have the capital markets, we have the legislation. It's just a question of political will to get a lot of this infrastructure built. I mean, the IRA is extremely economically beneficial, for example, if you are a battery manufacturer. One of the subsections in the IRA, I believe it's 45X, grants you a $45 per kilowatt hour credit at the module level if you are producing that material here in the United States. And so, just as to throw some hard data out there, we are already seeing how that is bearing fruit. Panasonic, right, one of the top 5 lithium-ion battery manufacturers in the world, is producing batteries in Nevada today. They're building another gigafactory in Kansas, and they reported, I believe it was for their last fiscal year, of 2024, 87 billion yen in tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act. That's about 580 million US dollars. And that's
Thank
just
you for
from
thank
what
you for the
exactly.
conversion.
I went ahead and did that before we chatted because I couldn't do it in my head either. But that is a significant amount of capital, quite frankly, that's going to come back to Panasonic. And so, the real beneficiaries thus far of the Inflation Reduction Act are foreign companies, foreign allies, right? Japan's an ally, South Korean companies are here, that have set up shop and are creating this ecosystem. And the question, your question earlier about why are we so reactive? I mean, unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that. I wish it were different, but I would, if there's one wish that I have, it would be that we don't try to catch up to the Chinese, right? Because I don't honestly think we ever will. I
Good
don't
point.
think
Yeah.
I don't think that we will ever match them or beat them on cost either. And so what do we do here in North America, whether or not you're Canadian or American or what have you? We have to innovate, right? We have to invent new chemistries. We have to invent new ways to separate and purify metals. And when we own that IP, then you can build infrastructure around
it.
these ideas. And again, I would argue, it's probably much more long-term economically beneficial to do something like that as opposed to just put money in a bazooka and invite foreign companies here in the United States to just set up shop. I mean, again, there are arguments on both sides of that, but I really think one of the great strengths of democracy and capitalism here in the United States and Canada is the ability to innovate. And this whole idea of Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction, right? So why not double down on that? I mean, again, we don't have to beat the Chinese, right? We don't even have to necessarily compete with them. We can just sort of create our own game and our own ecosystem here in the United States.
Yeah, that's interesting. We kind of got off antimony a little bit, but what I'm kind of hearing from you is antimony is just a small piece of the big picture. Really.
Yeah, I mean, we could have, as I mentioned before, the Chinese, I don't think they necessarily have a specific affinity for antimony, right? I mean, they've gone down the list, right? We saw this with gallium and germanium. We saw this with graphite, rare earth elements, like I mentioned before. And I think it's safe to assume that as trade tensions between the United States and China continue to simmer or, hopefully not boil over, you will see more of this type of behavior. So I don't necessarily think antimony is special in that regard. I just sort of think it was kind of next on the list.
And it's just, I guess, like when you only have 2 or 3 listed publicly companies that have leverage to it, those will certainly all of a sudden gravitate a lot of capital very quickly.
Of course,
right?
of course, right? And same thing happened with gallium and germanium, and I don't recall, but I'm assuming a lot of the graphite plays probably got a little
a little bit of a bump, but not like a multi-month bump, right? Like how lithium went on that crazy run. But graphite's just a real finicky metal for the market to understand, I think.
I think the challenge with graphite is that, while 60 to 70% of it is mined in China, well over 90% of the active anode material, so the high purity material that goes into batteries, that originates in China.
Yeah.
And so, with lithium, it's a much more diverse supply chain. I mean, the Chinese, the assets that they're mining in China, whether or not they're brine or hard rock, are quite frankly pretty low quality. But of course, again, they have whatever 70-ish% of lithium refining capacity onshore. So that, I think one of the reasons why lithium went crazy was partially because it's not substitutable.
Right.
I mean, again, we can argue about sodium ion batteries, but we're not here to do that today necessarily. And we're not there yet. You're correct. But lithium's lack of substitutability, especially in the battery game, was, I think, one of the reasons why you saw, I'll never forget, I think it was Tesla's battery day in late 2020, sort of October, November. Lithium was at about 6,000 USD per ton. Over the next 24 months or so, it went to 85,000. And it's just been on this sort of volatile yo-yo. And of course, today we're down at 10,000 for, a handful of reasons. But, my point is, there are substitutes and complements to graphite, right? I mean, a graphitic anode could have natural graphite. It could be purely synthetic.
Synthetic, yep.
Exactly. And now you're starting to see lithium metal anodes and silicon doped in the anodes. So it's not quite as clear a picture. And because the Chinese are so dominant there, I think that that might be one of the reasons why, to your point, you saw this little bump, but not what we saw in lithium.
Yeah. Two more questions, and we'll wrap it up. And one of them is like, wow, we got you here on lithium. This has been interesting the last few weeks.
Yeah. I mean,
Right?
things are things are starting to move. I mean, Rio Tinto has been I think, interested in lithium very publicly for a long time, right? I mean, they have an asset in Serbia that they have, quite frankly, run into a number of dead ends with respect to trying to develop that. And then, they decided, well, maybe that's not going to be the direction we go, and then decided to go and spend $900 million or so on a relatively developed but non-producing brine asset in Argentina. And so I remember looking at that and saying, gosh, you spent, $900 million just to get a seat at the table. Wouldn't it make sense to buy a producer? I mean, this is Rio Tinto, right? They got
sit at the head.
Of course.
Yeah.
And so anyways, that's exactly what they did. I think the Rio acquisition of Arcadium, and let's assume it goes through, was I don't want to call it a brilliant counter-cyclical move, because I think it was kind of a no-brainer, to be honest with you. I mean, Arcadium is a pure play, geographically and geologically diversified. There is a lot of capital that is going to have to be spent to develop both their brine and hard rock assets in the future. But Rio Tinto, I think, looked at the market and said, we feel like we're at the bottom. And so, $6.7 billion later, here they are. And so they are immediately, at the stroke of a pen, going to be a lithium producer, number one. And number two, I think one of the other things that they paid that close to 100% premium for was the direct lithium extraction technology that Arcadium has spent a long time perfecting.
Going back to the IP.
Absolutely.
Yeah, interesting.
Absolutely. That's what they bought.
Yeah.
And that's my view on that. So there's that. And then, of course, this morning, the General Motors and Lithium America deal, restructuring, I guess, of the deal was announced. But again, it's very significant when you think sort of longer term that General Motors has effectively committed close to $1 billion in helping LAC develop Thacker Pass. And so that whole paradigm between producer of, lithium in this case and offtaker has now changed. I mean, you could almost look at General Motors as a mining company in some respects. I wouldn't go as far, they're not going to be out there digging, but they're not just sort of passively, going to be paying for offtake. Obviously, they're going to own a piece of Thacker Pass and have skin in the game. So that is something that's new as well.
How do we get exposure to rare earths? Like, what is the safest way? Like, if I don't want to spend hours and hours looking at every financial statement of every company, how do I get exposure to these resource wars
Well, look, I mean, it depends how much research you want to do. And I think it also depends on your risk appetite. I mean, this is why the ETF boom, I think, has given people in some ways an easy out. There are rare earth focused or strategic metal focused or lithium or battery metal focused ETFs. I don't have any of the tickers off the top of my head, but and also I think it sort of depends on which rare metal or which strategic metal you're the most interested in. So obviously it's a pretty small list if we're just talking about rare earth elements. I mean, you've got MP Materials and you've got Linus that are producing. Energy Fuels, I think, is sort of a hybrid producer as well. I don't have any position in any of these guys. I'm just trying to list off some of the, let's say, the non-Chinese producers. But look, I think the ETF is probably the easy way out to start, and then you can sort of go from there and try and figure out, based on your risk profile and your investment timeline, how much risk you want to take. The only other thing I would say is that obviously, especially in the junior space, I mean, we all know that most of these pre-revenue plays, live and die by the trajectory of the price, the underlying price, right? And so, I don't know, lithium at $10,000, it's not whether or not we are at the bottom. I think we are. It's a question of how long we stay here, and that's kind of a longer discussion. But I would keep an eye on market tightness and price, because price is going to lead these guys out of the state that they're in right now.
Yeah. Well, I just looked it up. It looks like Van Eck Rare Earths and Strategic Metals ETF is an ETF for the rare earth side of things. So that's something that people
Okay.
can look at. Symbols REMX. Chris, thanks again. Awesome
Thank
chat.
you.
Yeah, always fun talking to you. Always, I always learn from you, and I think our audience always learns from you as well. And that's why you're one of our fan favorites. So thanks for your time, and we'll chat again.
All right. Sounds good, Arlen. Thank
Yeah,
you.
take care. Have a great day. Cheers.
You too.